Her iPhone Face ID kept failing on her boyfriend, so she ran a reverse image search and discovered the Vampire King owned half the city's infrastructure. What she didn't know, the search algorithm flagged her as a security breach, and now his counsel demanded she either accept his protection mark or vanish permanently. He had until sunrise to convince her. Maya Chen had always prided herself on noticing patterns, on catching the small inconsistencies that others missed, which was why the third Face ID failure in a week made her pause with her coffee mug halfway to her lips. Dominic leaned over her shoulder to look at the apartment listing she had pulled up on her phone, his cologne mixing with the scent of her vanilla candle, and the screen flashed that familiar error message again, the one that said it couldn't recognize her face even though she was staring directly at the camera. She laughed it off with a joke about needing better lighting, but the sound felt hollow in her throat, artificial in a way that made her think of all the other small moments she had ignored over the past 6 months. Later that night, after Dominic left with a kiss that lingered just a fraction too long and a promise to text her when he got home, Maya sat cross-legged on her bed with her phone in her hands and ran a diagnostic test, watching the progress bar crawl across the screen with the patience of someone who had spent 8 years working as a data analyst and knew that answers always revealed themselves if you waited long enough. And now's the time to stop and subscribe to our channel. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these tales travel across the world. Now let's continue. The phone recognized her perfectly when she tested it, the scan completing in less than a second, her face appearing as a perfect biometric match, which meant the problem was not with the device or with her. She pulled up her photo gallery, scrolling past pictures of her brother Jamie at his college graduation, past screenshots of work documents and memes she had saved to show Dominic later, until she found one of the few photos she had managed to take of him, a candid shot from their third date when she had caught him looking at the city skyline, with an expression she could only describe as ancient, as if he were remembering something from long before she was born. She positioned the phone to scan his face in the photo, holding her breath without realizing it, and the result made her stomach drop in a way that had nothing to do with hunger and everything to do with the sudden understanding that something was very wrong. The screen read, "No face detected," in clinical white letters, as if Dominic Ashford did not exist at all, as if the man she had been dating for half a year was somehow invisible to the very technology that had been designed to see everything. Curious was too mild a word for what she felt as she took a screenshot of his LinkedIn profile photo, the professional headshot where he wore a charcoal suit and that half smile that had first caught her attention at the Infrastructure Development Conference back in May, and opened a reverse image search engine, her fingers moving with the mechanical efficiency of someone who had performed this action 1,000 times for work, but never for something that made her pulse race like this. The memories came in flashes as the search loaded, sharp and vivid like photographs projected on a wall. She remembered meeting him in the hotel conference room, where he had been giving a presentation on sustainable urban power grids, how he had deflected every personal question she asked with charm and wit, but never actually answered anything about his family, or his past, or where he had grown up. She remembered how he never wanted to take selfies with her, always claiming the lighting was bad, or that he preferred to live in the moment rather than document it. She remembered the way he always paid in cash, pulling crisp bills from a leather wallet that looked expensive but worn, as if it had been carried for decades. The search results flooded her screen faster than she could process them, a cascade of images and documents that made no sense individually, but together formed a picture so impossible that her rational mind immediately began searching for explanations, for logical reasons why her boyfriend's face would appear in architectural plans from 1889. There was a sepia-toned photograph labeled D. Ashford Railway Baron, showing a man in Victorian clothing standing beside a steam engine, and the face was identical to the one she had kissed goodnight an hour ago, down to the small scar on his left jaw that he claimed came from a cycling accident in college. There was a Forbes article from 3 months ago about Ashford Infrastructure Holdings and its mysterious CEO, who owned the city's power grid and water supply and transit systems, who had somehow managed to acquire these assets over the past century through a complex web of shell companies and trusts. Same face staring back at her from every image, spanning 130 years of impossible history, and Maya felt her hands begin to shake as she clicked through page after page of documentation that her analytical mind could not dismiss as coincidence or Photoshop or a family resemblance. Her laptop screen flickered once, then twice, and a small red notification appeared in the corner, blocky text that read, "Unauthorized search detected," in a font she had never seen before, and before she could even process what that meant, her apartment plunged into darkness so complete that she could not see her own hands in front of her face. The hum of the refrigerator died, the glow of the streetlights outside her window vanished, and she realized with a cold clarity that made her skin prickle that the entire block had lost power, that someone or something had cut the electricity to her building with the precision of a surgeon removing a tumor. Her phone buzzed in her hand, the screen providing the only light in the suffocating blackness, and she looked down to see a text from Dominic that made her blood run cold, despite the rational part of her brain that insisted there had to be an explanation. "We need to talk. Now." The words sat there on her screen, simple and terrible, and Maya was still staring at them when she heard the knock at her door, 3 sharp raps that somehow sounded both polite and utterly final. She crossed her apartment in the darkness, her feet finding the familiar path between furniture by memory alone. And when she opened the door, Dominic stood there looking exactly as he had when he left, except now she could see the truth written in every line of his face, in the way he held himself with the stillness of something that did not need to breathe. "How did you get here so fast?" she asked, and her voice sounded strange to her own ears, too high and thin, because he lived across town and there was no way he could have arrived in the 15 minutes since he left, unless he had never actually left at all, unless he had been waiting and watching for her to do exactly what she had done. He stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, and closed the door behind him with a gentleness that felt like a threat. And when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of all those years she had seen in the photographs, centuries compressed into syllables. "You ran a search on my name," he said, and it was not a question. Maya felt anger flare hot in her chest, burning away some of the fear, and she lifted her phone to show him the screen full of impossible images. "You lied to me," she said, and the words came out sharper than she intended. "About everything." He did not deny it, did not offer excuses or explanations, just stood there in her darkened apartment and let her see him clearly for the first time. "I am the Vampire King," he said with the same casual tone he might use to discuss the weather. "And you just triggered a council security protocol." The words hung in the air between them, ridiculous and impossible and utterly true, and Maya felt the world tilt sideways in a way that had nothing to do with the darkness or the fear, and everything to do with the sudden understanding that reality was so much stranger than she had ever imagined. She wanted to laugh, wanted to dismiss it as an elaborate prank or a stress-induced hallucination. But then he pulled out his phone and showed her a surveillance feed, multiple camera angles of her apartment from perspectives that should not exist, and she could see herself in the footage from 10 minutes ago, sitting on her bed and running that reverse image search, could see the exact moment when her query pinged something in whatever system was watching. Disbelief gave way to anger, which gave way to fear as he explained the basics in a voice that remained calm and measured no matter how many times she interrupted with questions that had no good answers. "Vampires exist in hierarchies," he told her, "and I rule the eastern seaboard, have ruled it for longer than your great-grandparents have been alive. Technology is our vulnerability because we cast no reflections, leave no biometric signatures, cannot be captured by the devices that humans have come to trust more than their own eyes." He explained the rule with the efficiency of someone who had delivered this speech before, who had watched other humans receive this same terrible knowledge and make the same impossible choice. Any human who discovers vampire infrastructure becomes either protected through a blood bond or erased from existence, vanished so completely that even their families will struggle to remember their names. The council that governed alongside him had already been notified, he said, 7 ancient vampires who made him look young by comparison, and they had given him until sunrise to bring her before them either marked and compliant or not at all. 6 hours, she thought wildly, looking at the time on her phone and doing the math automatically. 6 hours to decide whether to tie herself to a creature she no longer knew or disappear into whatever void waited for humans who learned too much. What is a protection mark? She asked, because even in her fear she needed to understand the terms, needed to see the full picture before she could make any kind of decision. A blood bond, he answered, and something in his expression shifted, became almost vulnerable in a way she had never seen before. You would be under my shield, untouchable by council law or any other vampire. But you would also be mine in every sense of the word, bound to me in ways that human marriage cannot touch. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a silver ring set with a red stone that seemed to glow with its own internal light. And she recognized the symbol etched into the metal as the same one she had seen in those old photographs, in the architectural plans and the corporate documents. If you accept, you wear this, he said, holding it out to her like an offering or a threat. If you do not, then... He trailed off, not finishing the sentence. But Maya did not need him to, because the red laser dot that appeared on her window said everything he had left unspeaking. Dominic moved faster than her eyes could track, pulling her to the floor just as the glass exploded inward in a shower of crystalline rain, and she felt his body cover hers, solid and cold and impossibly strong. They are already here, he said into her ear, his breath somehow cool against her skin. We are out of time. The wall exploded outward in a spray of drywall and wooden studs, and Maya barely had time to process what was happening before Dominic hauled her through the jagged opening into the apartment next door, his fingers wrapped around her wrist with enough pressure to bruise but not enough to break, a careful violence that spoke of centuries of practice. The neighboring unit was dark and empty, furniture covered in white sheets like ghosts, and she stumbled over something she could not see as he pulled her toward the door, with a speed that made her lungs burn trying to keep up. Behind them she could hear footsteps, multiple sets, moving with inhuman precision through the hole he had created, and she understood with a clarity born of pure terror that running was not going to be enough, that whatever was chasing them could move faster than any human had the right to move. They hit the stairwell at a dead run, but instead of going up or down, Dominic wrenched open a maintenance door she had never noticed in all her years living in this building, revealing a service ladder that descended into darkness so complete it seemed to swallow the emergency lighting from above. Go, he said, and his voice carried an edge of command that made her obey without thinking, her hands finding the cold metal rungs and her feet following in a rhythm she did not have to consider. The descent lasted forever, and no time at all, her shoulders screaming and her palms slick with sweat, until finally her feet hit concrete and Dominic dropped beside her with barely a sound, like a cat landing from a fatal height. They were in a tunnel that smelled of oil and electricity and old water, the kind of infrastructure that existed beneath every city but that most people never saw, and dim emergency lights cast everything in shades of amber and shadow. This way, Dominic said, and took her hand again, gentler this time, leading her through a maze of passages that all looked identical to her untrained eye, but that he navigated with the confidence of someone who had built these tunnels himself, or at least had walked them so many times that every turn was etched into memory. The chase became real when she heard the echo of pursuit behind them, footsteps that rang against concrete with rhythmic precision, and Dominic pulled her faster, through a door marked authorized personnel only, and down a corridor lined with pipes that hissed and dripped condensation. She caught glimpses of things that made no sense in the fractured light. A checkpoint where a man in a security uniform nodded at Dominic without surprise, his neck bearing a mark that looked like a tattoo, but that seemed to shimmer with the same red light as the ring Dominic had shown her. A woman in a business suit passing in the opposite direction, moving with that same impossible grace, who met Maya's eyes for half a second and smiled in a way that showed too many teeth. Coded signals spray painted on the walls in colors that seemed to glow faintly, arrows and symbols that meant nothing to Maya, but everything to the creatures who used these passages as their hidden highways beneath the oblivious city above. "How long have you been king?" Maya gasped out between breaths that burned in her chest. And the question surprised her because of all the things she could have asked. It seemed the least important, but Dominic answered anyway as they ran. "A century," he said, and she could hear something in his voice that might have been loneliness if vampires felt such human things. "I inherited the throne from my predecessor, who grew tired of the politics and the endless negotiations and the weight of keeping two species from tearing each other apart." She wanted to ask more, wanted to understand how someone could live that long and remain sane, but then they burst through another door and into a transit tunnel proper, the kind where subway trains ran during the day, and Dominic pulled her onto the tracks with the certainty that they would not be electrocuted. The third rail was dead, she realized, because he controlled the power and had shut it down for exactly this purpose, had planned escape routes through his own infrastructure like a king preparing for siege. They climbed onto a maintenance platform and through a service hatch that brought them into a tunnel that sloped upward, her calves burning with the effort of the incline. And somewhere behind them, she could still hear the pursuit, though it seemed to be falling back, as if their hunters were content to follow at a distance rather than catch them outright. "I fell for you because you treated me like a normal man," Dominic said suddenly, the words coming out rough and unpracticed, as if he were not used to this kind of honesty. "You did not defer to me or fear me or want something from me beyond conversation and companionship. You argued with me about infrastructure policy and made jokes about my taste in coffee and never once looked at me like I was anything other than human." The confession hung in the air between them, vulnerable and raw, and Maya did not know what to say to that, did not know how to reconcile the monster who had shattered her wall with his bare hands, and the man who had held her hand in movie theaters and listened to her complain about her work projects with genuine interest. The tunnel ended at an elevator that required a keycard and a fingerprint scan, and Dominic placed his palm on the reader with the casual familiarity of someone who had installed the security himself, and the doors opened with a soft chime that seemed obscene after the violence of the past 20 minutes. They rode up in silence, Maya's ears popping with the rapid change in altitude, and when the doors opened again, they stepped into a glass penthouse that overlooked the city like a throne room built of windows and steel. The view was breathtaking, even in her exhausted state, the sprawl of lights that marked a million human lives unaware of the creatures who moved among them, and Maya walked toward the glass on legs that shook with adrenaline crash and fear, and something else she could not quite name. She was still staring at the city, trying to process everything that had happened, when a voice spoke, from behind her, cool and accented, and utterly calm. "The council convenes at dawn," the voice said. "You will attend." Maya turned to find a woman sitting in one of the leather chairs, as if she had been waiting for hours, legs crossed and hands folded over a manila folder that rested on her lap. She was beautiful in the way that predators were beautiful, all sharp angles and pale skin, and eyes that reflected the light like a cat's, and she wore a suit that probably cost more than Maya made in a month. "Elena Volkov," Dominic said, and his voice had gone flat and careful. "You are not welcome here." Elena smiled without warmth and opened the folder, pulling out photographs and documents that she spread across the glass coffee table with the precision of someone presenting evidence in court. Maya Chen, she said, reading from what looked like a dossier. 28 years old, data analyst for Richmond City Planning, guardian to one younger brother, both parents deceased in a car accident when she was 19. She looked up, meeting Maya's eyes with an expression that might have been sympathy if it had been genuine. "The council convenes at dawn, and you will attend," she repeated. "These are your options." She laid them out with clinical precision, each word chosen for maximum impact and minimum ambiguity. Option 1. Accept Dominic's mark. Become his protected consort. Live under his shield, but sacrifice your autonomy in every way that matters. Option 2. Accept a council mark. Become shared property of the governing body, subjected to interrogation about what else you know and what else you might have discovered. Option 3. Memory wipe and relocation, a procedure that will remove all knowledge of vampires from your mind, but also everything connected to that knowledge, which includes your relationship with Dominic, your memories of the past 6 months, possibly your brother if he has become too entangled in your life during that time. She paused, letting the implications sink in, and Maya understood that there was an unspoken option 4, the one that ended with her disappearing permanently in a way that left no body and no questions. "Why do you care?" Maya asked, and her voice sounded stronger than she felt. "I am one human who stumbled onto something by accident. Why does that matter enough to threaten my life?" Elena's expression shifted into something that might have been respect if it had not been buried under layers of contempt. "You are not the first human to discover us," she said. "But you are the first data analyst with the skills to cross-reference infrastructure records and expose the entire network. Your work project, the one mapping city utility overlaps for redundancy planning, do you know what that would reveal if you had dug just a little deeper?" Maya felt her stomach drop as the pieces clicked together in her mind, her analytical brain automatically running the calculations she had not completed. Her project had been comparing ownership, records across water, power, and transit systems, looking for overlap that might indicate vulnerability in the city's infrastructure. If she had expanded the search parameters, if she had looked at historical ownership patterns, if she had connected the shell companies and the trusts and the holding groups, she would have found the same names appearing again and again across decades and centuries, would have uncovered a web of vampire control so extensive that it would have been impossible to dismiss as coincidence. Dominic moved to stand beside her, his presence solid and real in a way that anchored her spinning thoughts. "The law is outdated," he said to Elena, and there was anger in his voice now, controlled but present. "Humans and vampires coexist now, whether the council wants to admit it or not. This secrecy serves no purpose except to maintain your power." "The law protects us," Elena countered, her tone never rising above conversational. She signed her fate when she hit search. She reached into her jacket and pulled out a black envelope, placing it on the table with the weight of a judge's gavel. The envelope was sealed with red wax stamped with a crest that showed 7 stars arranged in a circle. And Maya knew without being told that this was the formal summons, the official notification that her life had been deemed dangerous enough to warrant council attention. Maya's phone buzzed in her pocket, the vibrations startling in the tense silence, and she pulled it out to see a text from Jamie that made her blood run cold. "Where are you?" the message read. "Your building is on fire." She looked up at the windows, at the view that showed her neighborhood across the city, and she could see the distant glow of flames, the flashing lights of emergency vehicles, the pillar of smoke rising into the night sky. Dominic moved to a control panel on the wall and switched on a television, flipping to a news channel that showed her apartment building engulfed in fire, reporters speculating about gas leaks and electrical failures while firefighters struggled to contain the blaze. "They are sending a message," Dominic said quietly. "Anyone close to you is leverage." Maya felt rage cut through her fear like a blade, hot and clarifying, and she turned to Elena with an expression that made the ancient vampire's eyebrows rise fractionally. "You burned my home to cover your tracks," Maya said, and it was not a question. Elena did not bother to deny it, just stood and smoothed her suit with the casual indifference of someone who had committed far worse atrocities and lost no sleep over them. "I will see you at dawn," she said, and walked to the elevator as if she owned the building, which for all Maya knew, she might. The doors closed behind her, leaving Maya and Dominic alone in the glass tower that suddenly felt less like a sanctuary and more like a cage. "I need to call Jamie," Maya said, and Dominic nodded, pulling out a phone that looked different from any device she had seen before, something custom-built with encryption that probably cost more than her car. He handed it to her and she dialed her brother's number with shaking fingers, putting it on speaker so Dominic could hear. Jamie answered on the second ring, his voice tight with panic. "Maya, where are you?" he said. "The building. There are fire trucks everywhere and they said people might be trapped and I could not reach you." "I am fine," Maya said, forcing herself to sound calm. "I was not home." "Are you safe?" "I am at Derek's place," Jamie said, and she could hear him moving, probably pacing the way he did when he was stressed. "What is going on?" "I will explain later," Maya promised, knowing it was a lie, knowing she could never explain any of this in a way that would make sense. "Just stay where you are. Do not go back to the building. Promise me." He promised, reluctant and confused, and she ended the call before he could ask more questions she could not answer. The phone felt heavy in her hand as she gave it back to Dominic, and she walked to the window again, staring at the city that suddenly looked different now that she knew what moved beneath its surface. She made a decision then, standing in that tower of glass and steel, watching her old life burn in the distance. She would not run and she would not hide, but she needed answers before she could make any kind of choice about her future. "Tell me everything," she said to Dominic. "The council, the mark, what his really means when you say I would be yours." He joined her at the window, and together they stood looking out at the city that sprawled below them, and he began to explain in a voice that carried the weight of 3 centuries. They moved to the balcony, stepping into the cold night air that felt sharp and clean after the recycled atmosphere inside. And Dominic showed her his city with a gesture that encompassed the lights and the buildings and the invisible infrastructure that bound it all together. "I did not inherit this kingdom," he said. "I built it. For 3 centuries I have kept humans and vampires from war by controlling the systems that both species depend on. The hospitals are powered by my grid. The transit systems I modernized connect the city in ways that prevent territorial disputes. The water purification plants ensure that no one faction can poison or starve out another. Every piece of infrastructure is a thread in a web that keeps the peace." "And now you want to own me too," Maya said, and there was bitterness in her voice that she did not try to hide. "I want to protect you," Dominic corrected, and he turned to face her fully. "There is a difference." He told her then what he had never told anyone, that he had never offered his mark to another person in all his years as king, that he had watched humans come and go through his long life, and had never been tempted to bind any of them to him because the cost seemed too high and the burden too great. "But you made me want things I thought I had given up," he said. "You made me remember what it felt like to be seen as something other than a title or a threat." "What happens to you if I refuse and vanish?" Maya asked, because she needed to understand all the variables, needed to see the full picture the way she would analyze any dataset. Dominic was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was careful and measured. "The council loses faith in my judgment," he said. "I lose my throne. And the next king will not be as moderate as I have tried to be. The humans who bear protection marks now will find themselves without shields, and the balance I have spent centuries building will collapse into something far more brutal." She was still processing that, still trying to decide if it was manipulation or truth. or some combination of both, when a helicopter spotlight swept across the penthouse, blinding and sudden. Marcus Webb burst through the elevator doors, a human man with military bearing and scars that spoke of a violent past, and his expression was grim. "They have moved up the timeline," Marcus said without preamble. "The council convenes in 1 hour, not at dawn. They know she is here." Dominic swore in a language Maya did not recognize, and Marcus turned his attention to her with the assessing look of someone who had spent his life evaluating threats and assets. "We need to get you ready," he said. "The council chamber is not a place you go unprepared." They moved inside and Marcus produced clothing from somewhere, a dark dress that was elegant in its simplicity, cut to suggest formality without ostentation, symbolic armor in fabric form. He gave her tactical advice as she changed in the bathroom, his voice carrying through the door with the authority of someone who had survived situations far worse than this. "Do not show fear," he said. "Do not volunteer information. Let Dominic speak first unless you are directly addressed." Maya emerged wearing the dress and feeling like she was preparing for battle rather than a hearing, and she found that a third person had arrived, a woman who looked younger than Dominic, but who carried herself with the same predatory grace that marked all of them. Isadora, Dominic's sister, regarded Maya with sharp, intelligent eyes and offered a smile that seemed genuine despite the circumstances. "You are not the problem," Isadora said without preamble. "You are the excuse. Elena's faction has wanted to depose my brother for decades, and you are just their latest weapon." The words were brutal in their honesty, but Maya appreciated them more than she would have appreciated false comfort. Dominic pulled out the ring again, the silver band with its red stone, and held it out to her with an expression she could not quite read. "You do not have to love me," he said. "You do not even have to trust me, but this mark keeps you alive." Maya stared at the ring, at the symbol etched into the metal, at the stone that seemed to glow with its own internal light. She asked for 5 minutes alone and they gave it to her, retreating to the far side of the penthouse while she stood at the window and thought about Jamie and her career and her independence and everything she would be giving up if she accepted this bond. She thought about the man who had just revealed he had spent 300 years building a world to prevent exactly the kind of violence now aimed at her, who had chosen her out of all the humans he had known across all those years, who was offering her his protection at the cost of his throne if she refused. She thought about terrorists and negotiations, and the kind of person she wanted to be when faced with impossible choices. She walked back to where they waited and picked up the ring from where Dominic had left it on the table, and she slid it onto her finger before she could second-guess herself. The stone glowed red, brighter than before, and then settled into a steady pulse that matched her heartbeat, and she felt something shift in the air around her, as if the world had just rearranged itself to accommodate this new reality. Dominic's eyes widened, genuine surprise crossing his features for the first time since she had known him. "Why?" he asked, and she could hear the question beneath the question, could hear him asking why she would choose this when she could have chosen freedom. "Because I do not negotiate with terrorists," Maya said, meeting his gaze steadily. "And I do not run." The council chamber existed in a place that should not have existed, a converted bank vault 3 stories beneath the financial district where the bedrock itself had been carved away to create a space that felt both ancient and modern, glass walls etched with symbols that predated written language, enclosing a semicircle of 7 thrones that looked like they had been salvaged from cathedrals and castles across centuries. Maya descended the stairs with Dominic on one side and Marcus on the other, her hand resting lightly on the railing that felt cold enough to burn, and she could feel the weight of eyes watching her arrival with the intensity of predators calculating the threat level of potential prey. The thrones were occupied by 6 figures, who sat with the perfect stillness that marked their kind, and Dominic's tension radiated through the subtle tightening of his shoulders as he catalogued them for her, in a voice too low for anyone else to hear. Elena Volkov sat in the first throne, the enforcer from Russia who had already demonstrated her willingness to burn buildings and end lives. 600 years old and wearing her age like armor, her pale hair swept back from a face that would have been beautiful if it had held any warmth at all. Rafael Santos occupied the second position, 520 years carved into the lines around his eyes, representing South America with the quiet authority of someone who had survived colonial wars and revolutions and the endless churn of human politics. Yuki Tanaka sat in the third throne looking impossibly young despite being 701 years old, her jurisdiction covering Asia-Pacific with an efficiency that Dominic had once described as both terrifying and admirable. Aisha Nkrumah held the fourth position, 489 years of African history, written in the way she held herself, regal and unbending, her dark skin contrasting sharply with the white marble of her throne. Victor Constantine filled the fifth seat with the bulk of someone who had been a warrior before he was turned, 655 years of European conflicts informing every gesture, his eyes tracking Maya with the calculation of a general assessing battlefield positions. Celine Beaumont occupied the sixth throne, 530 years of Western territorial control, evident in the casual way she draped herself across ancient stone, her beauty the kind that poets wrote about and died for. The seventh throne sat empty, waiting for Dominic, but he did not move to claim it, instead standing in the center of the chamber with Maya at his side, and his hand resting lightly at the small of her back, in a gesture that was both protective and possessive. The room noticed the ring immediately, 6 pairs of ancient eyes fixing on Maya's hand, where the silver band caught the light, and the red stone pulsed with that steady rhythm that matched her heartbeat, and she watched shock ripple through the assembled vampires like a stone thrown into still water. Elena rose from her throne with the fluid grace of a hunting cat, her expression shifting from cold politeness into something harder and sharper. "You have marked her without council approval," she said, and her voice echoed off the glass walls with accusatory weight. "You have violated protocol." Dominic met her gaze without flinching, his own voice carrying the authority of someone who had ruled for a century and did not intend to apologize for his choices. "I have invoked sovereign right," he said. "She is under my protection." The words should have ended the discussion because sovereign right was ancient law, the privilege of a sitting king to extend protection without requiring council consensus. But Elena smiled in a way that showed too many teeth and gestured to one of the other vampires who stood against the wall like a statue. The vampire stepped forward carrying a tablet that looked absurdly modern in this space of ancient stone and older magic, and Elena took it with the delicacy of someone handling evidence that would seal a conviction. "I present new evidence to the council," she said, her voice taking on the formal cadence of someone conducting a trial. Surveillance footage recovered from Richmond City planning servers showing the human Maya Chen not merely searching for information about Dominic Ashford, but downloading classified infrastructure blueprints from her work server 3 weeks ago, before she claims to have known anything about our existence. She turned the tablet to face the assembled council, and Maya felt her stomach drop as she recognized the footage, security camera angles from her office showing her at her desk late one evening, downloading files to her personal drive, the timestamp clearly visible in the corner marking it as 3 weeks before she had run that reverse image search. Maya felt the ground tilt beneath her feet because she had downloaded those files, remembered doing it clearly, but it had been for a legitimate work project analyzing city grid inefficiencies for redundancy planning, nothing to do with vampires or conspiracies or anything except her job. She tried to speak, but Elena continued, her voice cutting through the chamber like a blade through silk. "The human claims ignorance, but the evidence suggests otherwise." She downloaded detailed blueprints of power grid infrastructure, water supply systems, and transit network maps. She cross-referenced ownership records and shell company structures, The pattern suggests industrial espionage, possibly working for a rival vampire faction seeking to challenge Eastern Seaboard territorial control, or worse, working for a hunter organization gathering intelligence for a coordinated strike against our holdings. Maya found her voice finally, the words coming out sharper than she intended. "That is insane," she said. "I downloaded those files for my job, for a project my supervisor assigned analyzing utility overlaps. I had no idea about vampires or factions or any of this until tonight." Elena's expression did not change, her skepticism evident in every line of her posture. "Convenient," she said, "that your assigned project happened to target exactly the infrastructure we control, that your relationship with our king happened to provide access to information and systems that would otherwise be impossible for a human to reach, that your search tonight happened to trigger our security protocols at a time when multiple hunter cells have been growing more active across the eastern seaboard." She turned to address the full council, her voice taking on the weight of formal accusation. "I move that we strip the protection mark as invalid due to conflicts of interest and security concerns. I move that we interrogate the human to determine her true purpose and affiliations. I move that upon completion of interrogation, we wipe her memories and relocate her to prevent further security breaches." Dominic stepped forward, his voice hard as granite. "You are manufacturing a case based on coincidence and paranoia." Maya Chen is a data analyst who stumbled onto information accidentally. She poses no threat. Elena met his challenge with ice-cold certainty. "Then let the council decide. By ancient law, we vote on all matters of territorial security. She is a security risk. The evidence is clear. Let the vote proceed." Maya watched as the 6 council members exchanged glances that spoke of conversations held long before this moment, of alliances formed and debts called in, of politics that had nothing to do with her and everything to do with the vampire standing at her side. Rafael Santos stood first, his voice carrying the weight of centuries spent navigating impossible situations. "I vote to uphold the protection mark," he said. "The evidence is circumstantial, and the sovereign right is clear law." Yuki Tanaka rose next, her expression unreadable. "I vote to strip the mark," she said. "The security concerns are valid, and precedent demands caution." Aisha Nkrumah stood with the grace of royalty long accustomed to making hard choices. "I vote to strip the mark," she said. "The human's work poses too great a risk regardless of intent." Victor Constantine hauled himself to his feet, his massive frame somehow making the ancient throne look small. "I vote to strip the mark," he said, though his eyes held something that might have been regret. "The law protects us all." Celine Beaumont rose last among the 6, her beauty somehow more terrible in the harsh light that filtered through the glass walls. "I vote to strip the mark," she said simply. "The motion carries 4-2. Elena turned to face Dominic with an expression of cold triumph. "By council law majority rules," she said. "The mark is void. Surrender her for interrogation and processing." The silence that followed felt like the moment before an avalanche, like the pause before a storm breaks, and Maya felt Dominic's hand tighten fractionally against her back before he stepped away from her and walked to his empty throne. He reached up and removed his own sigil ring, the one that marked him as king, the symbol of his authority and his burden and his 300 years of rule, and he placed it on the throne's armrest with a sound like a gavel falling. "Then I abdicate," he said, and his voice carried through the chamber with terrible finality. "You want her, you go through me as an equal, not a king." The chamber went absolutely silent, even the ambient sounds of ventilation and distant machinery seeming to stop, and Maya watched the 6 council members process what had just happened with expressions ranging from shock to fury to something that might have been fear. Victor Constantine leaned forward in his throne, his massive hands gripping the armrests hard enough that the stone cracked beneath his fingers. "You would abandon 3 centuries of rule for one human," he said, and it was not quite a question. Dominic met his gaze without hesitation, without doubt, without any of the political calculation that must have kept him alive and in power for so long. "I would abandon a corrupt law," he said. "If the council has become a tool for political assassination, if we manufacture evidence and twist facts to serve factional interests rather than genuine security, then it does not deserve my throne or my loyalty." Maya felt the air in the chamber change, felt something ancient and powerful responding to the words being spoken, and she watched as frost began to spread across the glass walls like living crystal. Intricate patterns forming and reforming in response to magic she did not understand but could feel in her bones. The chamber was responding to a kingless state, she realized, to the breaking of a bond that had held for a century, and the temperature dropped so rapidly that her breath began to fog in the air. Elena's expression had shifted from triumph to rage, her perfect composure cracking to reveal the predator beneath. "You cannot do this," she said, and for the first time her voice held something other than cold certainty. "The eastern seaboard needs a king. The territories need leadership. You are condemning us to chaos." Dominic turned to face her fully, and Maya saw in his expression the weight of every year he had lived, every compromise he had made, every burden he had carried in the name of peace. "I am condemning you to consequences," he said. "For too long this council has operated without accountability, has made decisions based on fear and power rather than justice and reason. If my abdication forces you to confront that reality, then it is worth the price." Raphael stood again, his voice cutting through the rising tension. "There are procedures for abdication," he said. "There must be a succession vote. There must be a transition of power. You cannot simply walk away." Dominic smiled, and it was not a kind expression. "Watch me," he said. Maya felt Marcus move to stand beside her, his presence solid and protective, and she realized that Isadora had appeared as well, flanking her other side, and together they formed a triangle of protection around her, even as the council chamber descended into chaos. Yuki's voice rose sharp and clear. "This is treason against the territorial compact." Aisha's response came swift and angry. "This is the action of someone who has lost perspective and judgment." Celine added her voice to the growing discord. "This is why humans cannot be trusted with our secrets." Victor slammed his fist against his throne and the sound echoed like thunder. "Enough!" he roared. "We will not resolve this through shouting. We will convene a formal succession hearing. We will follow the law, even if our king will not." Elena moved toward Maya with predatory intent, and Marcus shifted to block her, his hand moving to a weapon Maya had not noticed he was carrying, and suddenly the chamber was balanced on a knife edge between conversation and violence. Dominic's voice cut through the tension with the command of someone who might have abdicated his throne but had not lost his authority. "You will not touch her," he said to Elena. "You will not interrogate her. You will not wipe her memories. She is under my protection still, king or not, and if you want to test whether 300 years of building this infrastructure has left me without resources, then please proceed." The frost on the glass walls had spread to cover every surface, beautiful and terrible, and Maya understood that they were standing in a moment that would define everything that came after, that the choice Dominic had just made would ripple through the vampire world in ways she could not begin to predict. Victor stood slowly, his expression grave, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of genuine respect, despite the chaos. "You have forced our hand," he said to Dominic. "You have created a crisis that cannot be ignored or delayed. We will convene a full territorial hearing within 48 hours. Until then, the human remains in your custody, not as your marked consort, but as a witness whose testimony may be required." Elena opened her mouth to protest, but Victor continued over her. This is my ruling as senior council member in the absence of a sitting king. Does anyone challenge it? No one did, though Elena's expression promised that this was far from over, and Maya felt the tension in the chamber shift from immediate threat to simmering danger, from explosion to slow burn. Dominic collected his ring from the throne, sliding it back onto his finger with a gesture that seemed to carry its own significance, and he turned to Maya with an expression she could not quite read. "We are leaving," he said. "The council has made its position clear, and I have made mine. What comes next will not be decided in this chamber." They walked toward the stairs together, Marcus and Isadora maintaining their protective formation, and Maya could feel 6 pairs of ancient eyes watching their retreat with calculation and fury, and in Victor's case something that might have been approval buried under layers of political necessity. As they reached the top of the stairs, Elena's voice followed them, cold and clear and full of promise. "This is not finished," she said. "The hearing will determine if your abdication is valid, and if it is, then the human loses all protection. 48 hours, Dominic Ashford. Enjoy them." They emerged into the pre-dawn darkness, and Maya realized she was shaking, adrenaline and fear and shock finally catching up with her, and Dominic caught her elbow to steady her as they walked to the car that Marcus had waiting. "You gave up your throne," she said, and the words felt inadequate to describe what she had just witnessed. "For me." Dominic helped her into the vehicle and slid in beside her, his expression tired in a way that suggested exhaustion that went beyond the physical. "I gave up a title that had become meaningless," he said. "I did not give up the work, and I did not give up you." The car pulled away from the financial district as the sun began to color the eastern horizon, and Maya sat in silence trying to process the fact that in the space of one night, her entire world had been destroyed and rebuilt and destroyed again, and the only constant was the vampire sitting beside her who had just proven he would sacrifice everything he had built to protect her from the very world he had created. The chaos in the council chamber erupted the moment Dominic placed his ring on the throne, voices rising in overlapping accusations and demands as the ancient vampires processed what his abdication meant for territorial stability and the power structure they had maintained for centuries. Elena moved with predatory speed toward Maya, her hand outstretched to seize what she clearly viewed as forfeit now that Dominic had surrendered his crown. But Rafael Santos stepped between them with the kind of decisive movement that spoke of someone who had stopped violence before it could begin too many times to count. "He has invoked the old law," Rafael said, his voice cutting through the discord with authority that came from 500 years of navigating impossible political situations. "There must be a trial by ordeal." The chamber went quiet again, that terrible stillness that came when ancient creatures paused to consider options they had not used in lifetimes, and Maya felt Marcus shift beside her in a way that suggested he was preparing for the conversation to turn violent, despite Raphael's intervention. "The trial by ordeal," Victor said slowly, as if testing the words in his mouth. "That law has not been invoked in over 2 centuries. Raphael met his gaze steadily, his expression calm but firm. "The law still stands," he said. "When a human discovers our existence through circumstances that are disputed, when protection is contested by the council, the human may undergo 3 trials to prove their worthiness. If they pass all 3, they are granted permanent autonomy with no mark, no erasure, full knowledge and freedom to live as they choose. If they fail, they are turned over to the council for judgment." Maya felt her heart hammering against her ribs as she processed what Raphael was proposing. A path forward that did not involve immediate capture or memory wipe, but that clearly carried its own terrible risks. "What are the trials?" she asked, surprised that her voice came out steady when everything inside her was screaming. Raphael turned to address her directly, his ancient eyes holding something that might have been sympathy. "3 challenges designed to test your resourcefulness, your honesty, and your sacrifice," he said. The specific nature of each trial is determined by council consensus, and once they begin, the vampire who offered you protection cannot interfere or assist in any way. You will face them alone. Dominic stepped forward, his expression tight with barely controlled anger. This is a death sentence, he said. The trials were designed in an era when humans were considered little more than cattle. No one has passed all three in living memory. Then she will be the first, Raphael said quietly, or she will prove that Elena's concerns about security are justified. Either way, the law will have been satisfied, and the council will have its answer. Elena's fury had cooled into something more dangerous, a calculating coldness that suggested she was already planning how to ensure Maya's failure. I agree to the trial by ordeal, she said, her voice carrying the weight of formal acceptance. The human has demonstrated cunning in her escape tonight, and deception in her relationship with our former king. Let us see if those skills translate to survival under proper scrutiny. Victor looked to the other council members, reading their expressions with the ease of someone who had spent centuries interpreting the subtle politics of immortal beings. The trial is invoked, he said. Does anyone object? No one did, though Maya could see reluctance in some faces and anticipation in others, and she understood that this was as much about testing Dominic's judgment as it was about testing her own worthiness. The trials begin immediately, Elena said, rising from her throne with predatory grace. They must be completed before the next sunset, 24 hours from this moment. If she fails any trial, the remaining challenges are forfeit, and she is remanded to council custody. Raphael nodded his agreement and turned back to Maya with an expression that might have been encouragement if it had not been tempered by the knowledge of what she was about to face. You will be escorted to a holding chamber to await the first trial, he said. I suggest you rest while you can. Marcus started to protest, but Dominic placed a hand on his shoulder, a gesture that spoke of acceptance even as his expression remained tight with worry. Let them proceed, Dominic said quietly. She has chosen this path, and I will not dishonor that choice by interfering. Maya was escorted from the council chamber by two vampires she did not recognize, their hands never quite touching her, but their presence making it clear that escape was not an option, and they led her through corridors of stone and glass to a small room that held nothing but a narrow bed and a single chair. The door closed behind her with a sound like a vault ceiling, and she was alone with her racing thoughts and the understanding that the next 24 hours would determine whether she lived free or died under interrogation or vanished into whatever void the council reserved for humans who knew too much. She sat on the bed and tried to calm her breathing, tried to think through what little she knew about the trials and what skills she possessed that might help her survive them, when she heard a soft knock at the door. It opened to reveal Isadora, Dominic's sister, who slipped inside with the quiet efficiency of someone who did not want to be noticed. She held out a small glass vial filled with dark liquid that seemed to move of its own accord, and Maya took it automatically, her analytical mind already trying to identify what it contained. His blood, Isadora said softly. One drop will heal any injury, close any wound, restore strength when you have none left. Use it wisely, because you will only have this one chance. Maya stared at the vial, at the liquid that represented Dominic's essence distilled into something she could carry, and she felt the weight of the gift settle over her like armor. Why help me? She asked, meeting Isadora's eyes. You barely know me, and this puts you at risk with the council. Isadora smiled, and it was fierce and full of hope that Maya had not expected to see. Because if you survive, you will be the first human in 200 years to walk free with the truth, she said. That changes everything. It proves that coexistence is possible, that humans can be trusted with our secrets, that the laws we have maintained out of fear are no longer necessary. You are not just fighting for your own life, Maya Chen. You are fighting to change our entire world. She left as quietly as she had come, and Maya was alone again with the vial clutched in her hand and the understanding that she had somehow become a symbol for a conflict that had been brewing for centuries. She tucked the vial into her dress pocket and lay back on the narrow bed, forcing herself to rest even though sleep seemed impossible. And she went over everything she knew about infrastructure and patterns and the underground tunnels that Dominic had shown her during their escape. The first trial began exactly 3 hours later when the door opened and Elena stood framed in the entrance, her expression cold and satisfied. "The hunt begins now," she said. "You have 3 hours to evade capture in the tunnel system beneath the city. 5 vampires loyal to my faction have been granted permission to pursue you using non-lethal force. If you are caught, the trial ends and you fail. If you remain free for the full duration, you pass and proceed to the second trial." Maya stood, her muscles protesting after the brief rest that had not been nearly enough, and she followed Elena down corridors that descended deeper into the earth until they reached a junction where 5 vampires waited with the predatory stillness of hunters preparing for a chase. Elena gestured to a tunnel entrance that yawned dark and endless. "You have a 30-second head start," she said. "I suggest you use it well." Maya ran. The tunnel swallowed her in darkness that her human eyes struggled to penetrate, the emergency lighting spaced far enough apart that she had to navigate by memory and touch and the patterns she had memorized during her earlier escape with Dominic. She could hear the hunters behind her, footsteps that moved with inhuman speed and precision, and she forced herself to think past the fear and focus on what she knew. The tunnel system followed a logical grid based on the original city planning from the 19th century. Substrate routes connecting power stations and water treatment facilities and transit hubs in a web that made sense if you understood infrastructure design. She had studied these patterns for years in her work, had spent countless hours analyzing how systems connected and where redundancies existed, and which routes would be most efficient for emergency access. She used that knowledge now, taking turns that led away from the main thoroughfares and into maintenance corridors that the hunters might not expect, navigating by the sound of water in pipes and the feel of air currents that indicated ventilation shafts. She could hear them spreading out behind her, coordinating their search with the efficiency of a pack that had hunted together before, and she knew that her only advantage was her knowledge of the system and her ability to predict where they would look based on standard search patterns. She found a junction where 3 corridors met and chose the one that sloped downward, betting that they would expect her to seek higher ground and exits rather than descending deeper into the earth. The gamble paid off, and she gained precious minutes, her lungs burning and her legs aching from the sustained sprint. But she could still hear them in the distance, their pursuit relentless and patient in the way that only immortal hunters could afford to be. A laser sight cut through the darkness ahead of her, a red line that swept the corridor in methodical patterns, and Maya pressed herself against the wall and held her breath as the dot passed within inches of her chest. She waited until it moved away, and then slipped past, her footsteps silent on concrete that was damp with condensation, and she found a service ladder that led up to a higher level of tunnels that she hoped would throw off their tracking. Time became elastic in the darkness, stretching and compressing until she lost track of how long she had been running, and her sense of direction began to blur as exhaustion set in and fear made it harder to think clearly. She could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears, a rhythm that seemed impossibly loud and that she was certain would give away her position to hunters whose senses were far sharper than human normal. She took a turn into what she thought was a utility access and realized too late that it was a dead end, a maintenance chamber that had only one entrance and no other exits, and she heard footsteps approaching from behind with the certainty of hunters who knew they had cornered their prey. Maya pressed herself into the deepest shadow and felt the glass vial in her pocket, Isadora's gift that could heal any injury, and her mind raced through options as the footsteps grew closer. She could drink it now and hope the enhanced strength would let her fight past them. But she had no illusions about her ability to overcome 5 vampires in direct combat. She could save it for later trials where injury might be inevitable, but that assumed she survived this one. The laser sight swept into the chamber and found her immediately, the red dot settling on her chest like a target lock, and she heard voices conferring in a language she did not recognize. She made a decision born of desperation and analytical thinking in equal measure, pulling the vial from her pocket and shattering it against the concrete floor with enough force that the glass exploded, and the dark liquid spread across the ground in a pool that seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. The effect was immediate and dramatic, the pursuing vampires stopping in their tracks as the scent of Dominic's blood hit them, sacred and intoxicating and utterly unexpected in this context. Maya watched as their predatory focus fractured, as they moved toward the spilled blood with an intensity that spoke to instincts older than reason, and she used their moment of confusion to slip past them and back into the corridor beyond. She ran harder than before, her lungs screaming for air and her muscles burning with lactic acid buildup, but she could hear the chaos behind her as the hunters argued and scattered, their coordination broken by the distraction she had created. She navigated by pure instinct now, taking turns randomly and trusting her sense of the system's underlying logic, and when she finally saw light ahead, she nearly sobbed with relief. She emerged into a staging area where vampires and humans both waited, and she recognized it as the observation point where the council was monitoring the trial. She collapsed against the wall, her legs finally giving out, and she saw a digital clock that showed exactly 3 hours had elapsed since the trial began. Elena stood with her arms crossed, fury written in every line of her posture. "She cheated," Elena said, her voice tight with barely controlled rage. "She destroyed a sacred gift and used it as a weapon. That is not within the spirit of the trial." Raphael moved forward, his expression calm but firm. "She survived," he said. "The law says nothing about method, only outcome. She was not caught and the time limit has been satisfied. She passes the first trial." Maya felt hands helping her to her feet and realized it was Marcus, his expression caught between pride and worry, and she let him support her weight as she tried to catch her breath. She was bleeding from a gash on her arm that she did not remember getting. Her dress was torn and filthy, but she was alive and she had passed the first challenge. From somewhere above she heard the sound of stone cracking and looked up to see Dominic in the observation gallery, his hands gripped on the railing hard enough to shatter it, his expression a mixture of relief and anguish that spoke to how difficult it had been to watch without being able to help. Marcus spoke quietly, probably to Dominic, though Maya could not see his response. "She is tougher than you thought," he said. Dominic's reply came soft but clear. "I always knew," he said. "That is why I fell for her." The second trial began after Maya was given 30 minutes to clean her wounds and drink water. Hardly enough time to recover, but more than she had expected, given Elena's obvious desire to see her fail. She was led to a different chamber, this one dominated by a single chair that sat in the center of a circle carved into the floor, symbols etched around it that glowed with a faint blue light that made her skin prickle. "The challenge is truth," Victor said, stepping forward to explain the trial in his rumbling voice. "You will sit in that chair and answer 3 questions. The magic binding the circle will compel honesty, and any attempt to lie or deflect will cause pain that increases with each evasion. Answer truthfully, and you pass. Attempt deception, and you fail." Maya sat in the chair and felt the magic activate immediately, a pressure against her mind that was not quite pain, but that carried the promise of pain if she resisted. Elena stepped forward with the satisfaction of someone who had been waiting for this moment, and Maya knew that the questions had been chosen specifically to trap her no matter how she answered. "Did you download infrastructure files with intent to expose vampire holdings?" Elena asked, and her voice carried the weight of formal accusation. Maya felt the compulsion tighten, felt it searching her memories and intentions for any trace of deception, and she answered with the simple truth. "No," she said. I downloaded them for my job analyzing city grid inefficiencies. I did not know about vampires or their infrastructure until tonight. The magic accepted her answer, the pressure easing fractionally, and Elena's expression tightened with frustration. Second question, Elena said. Do you love Dominic Ashford, or are you using him for protection? Maya felt the compulsion dig deeper, felt it trying to extract certainty from emotions that were far more complex than simple binary options, and she paused as the pressure built. The silence stretched as she examined her own feelings with the same analytical precision she would apply to any difficult dataset, looking for the truth beneath the fear and the anger and the impossible circumstances. I do not know if I love him, she said finally, and the compulsion tightened like a vice around her thoughts. But I respect what he has built, and I am angry that he lied to me, and both of those things are true at the same time. The magic analyzed her answer, parsing the complexity and the contradictions, and after a moment that felt like an eternity, the pressure eased again. The answer was true even if it was not simple, and Maya felt sweat running down her spine from the effort of maintaining honesty under such intense scrutiny. Elena's third question came sharp and cutting. If you survive these trials, will you keep our existence secret? Maya felt the compulsion demanding an answer, demanding the pledge of secrecy that every other human in this situation must have given. The promise to hide what they knew and never speak of vampires to anyone. She thought about Jamie and her career and the infrastructure she had studied. Thought about the humans moving through the tunnels, wearing protection marks they had not chosen. Thought about Dominic's vision of a world where secrecy was no longer necessary. I do not know, she said, and the compulsion screamed against the answer, trying to force her to choose one way or the other. I have not decided if your existence deserves secrecy or exposure. The chamber erupted in voices, council members rising from their observation positions to argue and accuse, Elena's voice rising above the others to proclaim that Maya had just proven she was a security threat who could not be trusted. But the magic circle glowed brighter, the blue light intensifying as it confirmed what Maya had said, and Raphael's voice cut through the chaos with quiet authority. She is honest, he said. That is rarer than compliance. She has not lied, has not evaded. She has given us the truth even when it works against her own interests. That is exactly what this trial was designed to test. Elena turned on him with fury barely contained. She is a threat, Elena said. She just admitted she might expose us. Victor Constantine stood slowly, his massive frame commanding attention, and he looked at Maya with an expression that was difficult to read. One trial remains, he said. Let it proceed. He glanced toward where Dominic stood in the observation area, and something passed between them, some understanding or recognition that Maya could not interpret, and she felt the weight of that exchange, even though she did not understand its meaning. The third trial came after another brief rest period, and this time Dominic was allowed to visit her in the holding chamber under Marcus's supervision. He brought water and food that she forced herself to eat, even though her stomach was twisted with anxiety, and he tended to the cut on her arm with gentle hands that shook slightly. You really gave up your throne for me, Maya said, because she needed to hear him say it again, needed to understand why someone would sacrifice so much for a person they had only known for 6 months. I gave up a title, Dominic said, meeting her eyes. I did not give up the work. The infrastructure I built still exists. The systems I put in place still function. A throne is just a symbol, and symbols can be reclaimed or discarded as needed. He explained his vision as he worked, his voice quiet but intense, describing a world where vampires did not rule from shadows, where humans knew about their existence and chose coexistence based on shared interests rather than enforced ignorance. You asked if our existence deserves secrecy, he said. I have asked myself that same question for a century, and I do not have an answer either. but I know that fear-based secrecy creates the very dangers it claims to prevent. Maya found herself talking about her own past, about losing her parents in a car accident when she was 19 and suddenly being responsible for a 13-year-old brother, about building her career from nothing while raising Jamie and making sure he got to college, about the fierce independence that had defined her entire adult life. "You have been protecting people your whole life," Dominic said softly. "So have I. Maybe that is why." He did not finish the sentence, but the weight of it hung between them, the recognition of two people who had spent their lives building walls and systems to keep others safe, and who had somehow found in each other someone who understood that burden. Marcus appeared in the doorway, his expression apologetic. "It is time," he said. "Trial 3. Maya stood and Dominic caught her hand, his fingers cold against her skin. "Whatever happens," he said, "you were right to choose yourself over fear. Do not stop now." The third trial chamber held two doors, identical in appearance except that one had a handle and one did not, and Maya understood immediately that this was a choice that would define everything that came after. Victor explained the rules in his rumbling voice. "Door 1 opens immediately," he said. "You walk through and you walk free with your memories intact and your knowledge preserved. But your brother Jamie will be marked by the council as collateral insurance. He will be watched, controlled, potentially turned into leverage if you ever threaten our security." "Door 2 is locked," Victor continued. "It can only be opened by offering something of equal value to what you are asking, which is freedom with no strings attached. The magic will judge whether your offering is worthy. If it accepts you, walk free, and your brother remains untouched. If it rejects your offering, you fail the trial." Maya walked toward the doors, her mind racing through calculations and scenarios. Elena watched with barely concealed satisfaction, because this was the trap. This was the choice that almost every human had failed, because Doctor 1 offered immediate relief, while Doctor 2 required a sacrifice that most people could not make. Maya stopped in front of door 2 and examined the surface, seeing the symbols carved into the wood, and the lock mechanism that was not mechanical but magical, a blood seal that would analyze intent and value and determine worthiness. She had nothing physical to offer, no wealth or power or anything that the ancient magic would consider equal to the freedom she was requesting. She pulled a small piece of glass from her torn dress, a shard left over from the vial she had shattered in the first trial, and she used it to cut across her palm in a line that burned and bled freely. She pressed her bleeding hand to the door and spoke the offering that came from her analytical mind and her protective heart in equal measure. "I offer my silence," she said clearly. "Not forever, but long enough to prove coexistence is possible. I offer my skills, my knowledge, my word that I will help you build a world where vampires and humans can live together openly. I offer everything I have, which is my ability to see patterns and create systems, and my commitment to preventing the war that will destroy both our species if we continue on this path." The magic responded immediately, cold light flooding the chamber as the blood seal analyzed her offering, parsing her intent and measuring the value of what she was proposing against what she was asking. The light grew brighter, almost blinding, and Maya felt the magic digging into her mind and her heart, examining every corner of her being to determine if she was sincere or desperate or simply bargaining for her life. The door opened. The council chamber erupted in shock, voices rising in disbelief and argument, and Maya stood with her bleeding hands still pressed to the wood and watched ancient vampires process what had just happened. "No human has opened door 2 in the law's 500-year history," Raphael said, and there was wonder in his voice. Elena moved forward, her fury finally breaking through her controlled facade. "This is invalid," she said. "She is bargaining, not sacrificing. She is offering future service in exchange for present freedom. That is negotiation, not worthy offering." Raphael turned to face her, his expression calm but firm. "She is offering her skills, her knowledge, her word," he said. That is everything she has. She is not offering money or power or anything external. She is offering herself, her commitment, her future. The door accepted because the magic recognized that, as a sacrifice of equal value. Victor stood, and the chamber quieted, all eyes turning to the massive vampire who had been a warrior before he was a politician. "The trials are complete," he said. "The human has proven her resourcefulness, her honesty, and her willingness to sacrifice for freedom. By ancient law, she has earned autonomy." Elena's voice cut through with desperate anger. "This sets a precedent that will undermine everything we have built." Victor met her gaze steadily and said words that would echo through the vampire world for years to come. "Good," he said. "We need one." He revealed then what Maya had not known, that he had been waiting for this moment for decades, that he was part of the reformist faction, but had needed proof that a human could be trusted before he would vote to change laws that had stood for centuries. "Maya Chen has provided that proof," he said. "I call for a vote to grant her the status of acknowledged human, the first in 2 centuries, with full autonomy and full knowledge and no mark or control." The vote was called, and Maya watched as hands rose one by one. Victor, Raphael, Yuki after a long pause, Aisha with visible reluctance, Celine with a shrug that suggested indifference. 5 votes in favor. Only Elena and one other council member voted against, and the majority carried the decision into law. "You are free," Victor said to Maya. "You walk in both worlds now, knowing what exists, and choosing how to live with that knowledge." But Elena leaned close as Maya turned to leave, her voice low and full of promise. "You have made an enemy," she said. "Dominic will not always be there to protect you." Maya met her gaze without flinching. "Then I will protect myself," she said, and walked out of the chamber into a world that had just become infinitely more complicated and more dangerous and more full of possibility than it had been 24 hours before. The warehouse fell into chaos as Dominic hit the ground, silver spreading through his system like poison, and Maya dropped to her knees beside him with her hands already moving to assess the damage, even as her mind screamed that she did not know how to treat a vampire wounded by the one substance that could actually kill them. Marcus and Isadora were already in motion, scanning rooftops for the sniper, while Sarah's hunters raised weapons in confusion, unsure whether this was an attack on the peace talks or part of some elaborate vampire trick. Maya pressed her hands against Dominic's shoulder, where dark blood welled around the silver bullet, his skin burning hot under her touch as his body tried to fight the foreign metal and failed. She could feel his heartbeat stuttering, irregular, his breathing shallow, and she looked up at Marcus with desperate eyes. "The bullet has to come out," Marcus said, already moving toward them. "Silver stops our healing, keeps the wound open. If it stays in, he will die." Maya's medical knowledge was limited to basic first aid, but she understood penetrating trauma, understood that removing a bullet in the field was dangerous, but that leaving silver in a vampire's body was immediately fatal. She pulled off her jacket and wadded it against the entry wound while Marcus produced a knife from somewhere, the blade gleaming clean, and she realized he was about to perform field surgery in a warehouse surrounded by hunters who might decide at any moment that this was their opportunity to eliminate a weakened vampire king. Sarah stepped forward, her weapon lowered but not holstered, and her voice carried authority that made her team hold position. "Nobody fires," she said. "This was not us." Maya met her eyes, searching for deception and finding only grim calculation. Sarah was a pragmatist, someone who understood that losing their negotiating partner in the first 5 minutes of peace talks was strategically idiotic, regardless of personal feelings about vampires. "One of your people," Sarah said to Maya, though her gaze was on the rooftops where the shot had originated. "This was meant to stop the alliance before it started." "Elena," Isadora said, the name coming out like a curse. She is the only council member with resources positioned to surveil this location and motivation to sabotage negotiations. Marcus had already started cutting, his hands steady despite the urgency, and Dominic made a sound low in his throat that spoke to pain he was trying not to show. Maya held his other hand without thinking about it, her analytical mind noting details, while her emotional core simply tried to keep him conscious and breathing. The bullet came out with a wet sound that made Maya's stomach turn. Silver-coated lead that Marcus dropped on the concrete floor where it hissed and steamed. The wound immediately began to close, flesh knitting together with the unnatural speed of vampire healing. But Dominic was pale in a way that suggested the silver had done systemic damage. Beyond the immediate injury. "He needs blood," Isadora said quietly, and the statement hung in the air with all its implications. The hunters shifted, hands tightening on weapons, because everyone in the warehouse understood what that meant, and what it would look like if vampires started feeding in front of humans who had spent their lives hunting exactly that behavior. Maya made a decision without fully thinking it through, driven by instinct and the memory of Isadora's gift during the trials. She pulled the knife from Marcus's hand and cut across her own wrist before anyone could stop her, deep enough to bleed freely, and pressed the wound to Dominic's mouth. "Take it," she said. "You saved my life. Let me return the favor." The warehouse went absolutely silent as Dominic's eyes opened, unfocused and dark, his vampire nature responding to the scent of fresh blood, even as his conscious mind tried to resist. Maya felt his hand come up to steady her wrist, felt the moment his fangs extended and pierced her skin, felt the pull as he began to drink. It did not hurt exactly, but the sensation was intimate and overwhelming. A connection that went beyond the physical exchange of blood to something that felt like sharing pieces of herself directly into his body. She watched color return to his face, watched the trembling in his hands subside, watched consciousness sharpen in his eyes as the blood counteracted the silver poisoning. He only took enough to stabilize, maybe 30 seconds of drinking that felt like an eternity, and when he released her wrist, the puncture wounds were already clotting. Maya felt lightheaded but functional, her body compensating for the blood loss, and she let Marcus help her sit back while Isadora tended to Dominic with the efficiency of someone who had done battlefield triage many times before. Sarah was staring at Maya with an expression caught between horror and fascination. "You just fed a vampire," she said, and her voice carried the weight of accusation and confusion in equal measure. "You gave him your blood voluntarily." Maya met her gaze steadily, even though the warehouse was tilting slightly in her vision. "I saved his life," she said. "The same way he just saved mine. That is what partnership looks like." Dominic sat up slowly, his hand going to his shoulder where the wound had closed to an angry red scar that would fade completely within hours. He looked at Maya with an expression that held too many emotions to parse, and then turned his attention to Sarah with the full force of his presence. The power that came from centuries of leadership and the fury of someone who had just been shot during peace negotiations. "This is exactly what Elena wants," he said, his voice rough but controlled. "She wants us to turn on each other, to abandon diplomacy and return to the shadows and the hunting and the fear. If we let this shooting derail what we are trying to build here, she wins, and both our peoples lose." Sarah's jaw was tight, but she nodded slowly. "I need to know my people are safe," she said. "I need guarantees that vampires who break the law will face consequences, not protection from their kind." Dominic pulled himself to his feet with Marcus's help, standing despite the lingering weakness from silver and blood loss. "I will give you a list," he said. "Every rogue vampire my network has identified in the last decade. Names, locations, known associates. You help me eliminate them, and I will help you protect human victims. We work together, or we die separately." The negotiation that followed was tense and detailed, both sides parsing language and looking for traps, but Maya watched as something remarkable happened in that warehouse. surrounded by weapons and suspicion. Two leaders, who had every reason to be enemies, found common ground in their shared desire to protect their people, and they began to build a framework that might actually work if they could survive the opposition from their own sides. The terms they agreed on were stark and practical. Vampires would provide intelligence on rogues who killed humans, locations and patterns and weaknesses. Hunters would target only confirmed threats, not entire vampire populations. Maya would act as neutral liaison, carrying information between groups and verifying compliance. Any violation by either side would void the agreement immediately. It was fragile and unofficial, and likely to collapse under the first real pressure, but it was more than had existed an hour ago. Sarah extended her hand to Dominic, the gesture formal and weighted with significance, and he took it carefully, his vampire strength controlled so the handshake was firm but not crushing. "We have a deal," Sarah said. "Conditional, probationary, and subject to review. But a deal." Dominic nodded. "I will send the first intelligence packet within 48 hours," he said. "Confirmed rogue sighting in the Port District, 3 victims in the last month. Your team handles it, and we will know this partnership can function." Sarah's team began to withdraw, weapons lowered but ready, eyes never leaving the vampires as they backed toward the warehouse exit. Sarah paused at the door and looked back at Maya. "You are either the bravest person I have ever met, or the most foolish," she said. "I have not decided which." "Maybe both," Maya said, and felt Dominic's hand steady her as the blood loss and adrenaline crash finally caught up with her. Sarah left, and the warehouse was suddenly quiet except for the 3 vampires and 1 human who had just gambled on coexistence and survived the first round. Isadora was already on her phone, coordinating security and tracking the sniper who had disappeared into the city, her voice clipped and professional. Marcus stood guard at the entrance, his posture radiating the controlled violence of someone ready for the next attack. Dominic turned to Maya and cupped her face in his hands, his expression holding relief and fury, and something deeper that made her chest ache. "You could have died," he said. "That bullet was meant for you, and I could not let that happen." Maya covered his hands with hers, feeling the tremor that still ran through him from the silver. "You took a bullet for me," she said. "We are even." "We are not even close to even," Dominic said. And he kissed her finally, properly, with none of the hesitation or performance from their early relationship. This kiss was real and desperate and full of the understanding that they had both nearly lost something they were only beginning to recognize as essential. Maya kissed him back and tasted copper and survival and the beginning of something that might be love if they could keep each other alive long enough to find out. They broke apart when Isadora cleared her throat pointedly. "Elena will escalate," she said. "The sniper failed and the peace talks succeeded. She will see this as a crisis that requires immediate response. We need to return to secure location and plan next moves." The 2 weeks that followed the warehouse confrontation were marked by careful progress and constant tension, the fragile alliance between vampires and hunters tested daily by small incidents and mutual suspicion. Maya threw herself into the liaison work with the same analytical intensity she had brought to infrastructure analysis, building databases of rogue activity and cross-referencing hunter intelligence with vampire surveillance networks. She worked from a neutral office that Dominic had secured, a space that belonged to neither faction, and she established protocols for information sharing that protected sources on both sides. Jamie had been kept in protective custody during the initial crisis, guarded by Marcus's people in a safe house that was comfortable but secure, and when Maya was finally allowed to see him, she held him longer than she had since he was a child. The reunion was emotional and complicated because she could not tell him everything, but she needed to tell him enough to explain the danger and the changes in her life. "I got mixed up with some powerful people," she said, sitting across from him in the safe house living room. "But it is resolved now. There are still risks, but they are managed." Jamie studied her with the sharp intelligence that reminded her why she had fought so hard to get him through school. "Does this have to do with Dominic?" he asked, and his tone suggested he had already pieced together more than she had told him. "Yes," Maya said, because lying to her brother felt impossible after everything she had been through. "Are you safe?" Jamie asked, and the question held all the worry and protectiveness that had defined their relationship since their parents died. "I am now," Maya said, and hoped it was true. She returned to work at her regular job because maintaining normalcy felt important, but everything looked different now that she could see the vampire infrastructure woven through the city systems. She noticed the power substations that drew slightly more electricity than their registered capacity, the utility tunnels that appeared on schematics but not on maintenance schedules, the real estate holdings that changed hands without public record. She started a secret project in her spare time, mapping models for coexistence, studying cities where vampire and human populations might collaborate openly, analyzing what systems would need to change and what could stay the same. Dominic had reclaimed his throne after the trials, the council voting to reinstate him in recognition that his abdication had been a principled stand rather than abandonment of duty. But the fracture remained visible in every council meeting, Elena's faction pushing back against every reform proposal and building alliances with traditionalists who saw any change as weakness. The romantic development between Maya and Dominic proceeded carefully, built on honesty rather than the deception that had characterized their early relationship. He showed her his world, the vampire society that existed in layers beneath human awareness, the art collections and libraries and social structures that had evolved over centuries. She showed him hers, the human resilience and innovation in messy democracy that vampires often dismissed as chaos, but that she argued was actually sophisticated adaptation. They went on an actual date 2 weeks after the warehouse confrontation, Dominic taking her to a rooftop he owned that overlooked the city in all directions, lights spreading to the horizon like a living map. They talked about what his and mine could mean when applied to two people from fundamentally different worlds, trying to build something together. "I do not want to be a possession," Maya said, looking out at the city rather than at him because the vulnerability felt easier to express that way. "I need to be my own person, make my own choices, have my own life that is not defined by being the human who knows about vampires." "I do not want a possession," Dominic said, and she heard the sincerity in his voice. "I want a partner, someone who challenges me and sees me clearly and chooses to stay anyway. Someone who makes me question assumptions I have held for a century and forces me to build better systems." The kiss happened naturally this time, without performance or audience. Just two people who had survived impossible trials and found something worth protecting in each other. Maya leaned into it and felt his arms around her, and let herself believe for a moment that coexistence might actually be possible if they could navigate the politics and the danger and the fundamental differences between their natures. The kiss was interrupted by Marcus arriving on the rooftop, moving fast enough that Maya knew something was wrong before he even spoke. He was injured, blood staining his shirt from a wound that was healing but that had clearly been recent and serious. "Elena has made a move," Marcus said, his voice tight with pain and urgency. "She leaked evidence of Maya's collaboration with vampires to a human hunter organization, not Sarah's group, but a more radical faction. They are coming for Maya, believing she is a traitor to humanity." The complication landed like a physical blow, Maya's mind immediately jumping to implications and cascading consequences. The Vampire Council could not openly defend her without revealing themselves to the wider human world, which would trigger exactly the war they were trying to prevent. Dominic was already moving toward the rooftop exit, his expression set in the cold fury that Maya had learned meant he was planning violence. "I will handle this," he said. Maya caught his arm, stopping him with touch rather than strength. "No," she said. "This is my fight. You have fought for me during the trials and afterward. Let me fight for myself. Isadora arrived moments later, her expression grim as she reported what her intelligence network had uncovered. The hunters were a splinter group that rejected Sarah's diplomatic approach, believers in total vampire extermination who saw any human cooperation as betrayal. They had been fed carefully edited footage of Maya at the warehouse, images that made it look like she was conspiring with vampires rather than negotiating peace. Maya decided to meet with the hunters rather than hide, to explain the truth and try to negotiate the same way she had with Sarah. Isadora shook her head sharply. That is suicide, she said. These are not rational actors looking for compromise. They are zealots looking for an excuse to start killing. Or it is the first real test of coexistence, Maya said. If I cannot convince humans that working with vampires serves our collective interests, then the entire project fails anyway. Dominic wanted to stop her, wanted to lock her in a secure location, and deal with the threat through violence and intimidation, but he understood what she was saying because he had built his own power on the belief that better systems were possible. He gave her a wire so he could hear everything, a tracker so he could find her anywhere, and a promise that carried the weight of centuries. I will be close, he said. You are not alone. Maya walked into an abandoned warehouse on the industrial waterfront to meet the hunter leader, a woman named Sarah Cross, whose family had been killed by a rogue vampire decades ago, and who had spent her entire adult life hunting in response to that trauma. The warehouse was cold and dark, lit by work lights that created harsh shadows, and Maya counted at least 15 hunters positioned around the space, with weapons trained on the center where she stood. Sarah Cross stepped forward from the shadows, a woman in her 40s with scars on her face and hands that spoke to a life of violence. She studied Maya with the intensity of someone looking for evidence to confirm beliefs already held. You are not marked, Sarah said, and it sounded like an accusation. You show no signs of turning or compulsion. So why are you collaborating with monsters? Maya kept her hands visible and her voice steady. Vampires exist, she said. That is a fact regardless of whether we acknowledge it. Some are monsters who kill without conscience. But some have kept this city running, maintained infrastructure, prevented larger conflicts for over a century. If you kill indiscriminately, you will start a war that destroys both sides. Pretty speech from someone sleeping with the Vampire King, Sarah said, and her tone was dismissive. Maya felt anger flash through her, but channeled it into clarity. I am not defending him, she said. I am defending the possibility that we do not have to annihilate each other, that we can build systems where both species coexist with accountability and consequences for those who break the laws we agree on. Sarah's expression shifted to something that might have been respect or might have been calculation. The hunters have been watching Dominic for years, she admitted, waiting for proof of vampire infrastructure and organization. We know about the council, the holdings, the marks. We have been preparing for war, and your little trial bought us time to arm up with weapons that actually work against vampires. So thanks for that. The trap sprung shut around Maya as she realized the meeting had never been about negotiation, that Elena had fed the hunters information hoping they would kill Maya and spark the conflict that would justify vampire crackdown and eliminate reformists in a single stroke. Sarah's team moved to surround her more tightly, weapons shifting from defensive positions to capture formation. You are coming with us, Sarah said. Leverage against the Vampire King works better when the hostage is alive and intact. Maya did not wait to be captured, muscle memory from 2 weeks of training with Marcus overriding her instinct to freeze. She moved low and fast, using techniques Marcus had drilled into her for fighting opponents with superior strength and speed, and she managed to trigger the tracker on her wrist before the first hunter reached her. She fought hard enough to make capture difficult, buying seconds that felt like hours, And then the warehouse ceiling exploded inward as Dominic, Marcus, and Isadora crashed through in a shower of glass and metal. The standoff that followed was precisely balanced violence, vampires and hunters facing each other across open space with Maya in the middle, everyone armed and ready, and waiting for someone to make the first move that would turn negotiation into massacre. Maya stood in the no-man's land between the two sides, unarmed and human, and furious at the waste of it all, at the way fear kept driving both groups toward the exact outcome they claimed to want to prevent. "Stop!" she shouted, and somehow impossibly both sides froze. Her voice carried authority born from surviving trials and facing down ancient vampires and refusing to let terror dictate her choices. If either side fires you, fires. Prove the other right, she said into the terrible silence. You confirm every fear, justify every prejudice, guarantee the war that will kill thousands. Is that what you want? The wedding was planned for late spring, when the Brownstones' garden would be in full bloom, a small, intimate ceremony that reflected both their natures. Elena wanted simple and personal, rather than the elaborate vampire state affair that Lucian's position technically demanded, and he agreed immediately, because making her happy was his primary concern. They limited the guest list to 30 people, a mix of vampire and human friends who had supported them through the chaos of the past year. Victor took charge of security with his usual efficiency, establishing perimeters and screening every guest personally. Sienna appointed herself wedding planner and threw herself into the role with enthusiasm that was slightly terrifying, coordinating vendors and timelines with military precision. Dr. Tanaka helped Elena choose readings that honored both her Basque heritage and Lucian's French origins, finding poetry that transcended the boundaries between their worlds. Rosa flew in from California with her husband and children, and cried when she saw the ring and heard the story of how Elena had found family in the most unexpected way. The ceremony was set for twilight in the garden, that liminal time when day shifted to night, and both humans and vampires could comfortably gather. Elena worked with a designer to create a dress that was elegant but simple, off-white silk with delicate embroidery along the hem that echoed the patterns in Isadora's lullaby when translated to visual form. Mia's flower girl dress matched in miniature, and she practiced her walk down the aisle with serious concentration for weeks beforehand. Nikolai's role as ring-bearer required Victor to carry him, the baby dressed in a tiny suit that made him look impossibly formal and adorable. Lucien wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit with a deep red tie that matched Elena's bouquet of roses and peonies, and when Elena saw him waiting at the altar in the garden, her breath caught at how handsome and nervous he looked. The ceremony itself was short and deeply personal. Victor officiated, having gotten ordained online for the occasion through a process he refused to explain in detail. He spoke briefly about the nature of family, how it wasn't always defined by blood or species, but by choice and commitment. How Elena and Lucien had chosen each other and their children despite every obstacle, and how that choice was worth celebrating. Then it was time for vows, and Lucien spoke first with his voice carrying clearly in the quiet garden. Elena, he began, I've lived for over 8 centuries and learned that forever isn't always a blessing. The years can be hollow, endless, meaningless, without purpose or love. I thought I understood eternity until I lost Isadora. And then I learned that forever can be a curse when you're alone. You taught me that eternity can be a gift again. You brought light and laughter back into my life. You loved my son when you had every reason to protect your own heart. You faced down ancient vampires and political intrigue and never once backed down. He paused and glanced at the children sitting in the front row with Sienna. Isadora led you to us. I feel her blessing in the lullaby you sing, in the way Nikolai reaches for you, in the family we've built from loss and hope. I promise to honor both the love I lost and the love I've found, to protect you and our children with everything I am, to support your dreams and growth, to learn to cook properly so you don't have to clean batter off the ceiling anymore. Laughter rippled through the small gathering, and Elena smiled through tears. To build a future worthy of the family we're creating, Lucien finished. To love you for all the forevers I have left, now and always. Elena took a shaky breath before beginning her own vows. Lucien, I've spent most of my life running. From my past, from hard truths, from anything that felt too big or scary to handle. You made me want to stop running. You made me want to stay and fight and build something real. When I first sang to Nikolai, I had no idea that lullaby would lead me here, to you, to this family. She looked at their children and felt her heart expand. You've given me safety and partnership, and a love that doesn't ask me to be smaller or quieter or less than I am. You've welcomed Mia into your life with such patience and care. You've taught me that my heritage isn't something to fear, but to embrace. You've shown me that family can be chosen and built rather than just inherited. I promise to keep singing, Elena continued, to keep our family's voice alive through whatever comes next, to face the challenges we'll encounter together rather than alone, to support your work on the council and raise our children to be brave and kind, to love you with everything I have, human heart and vampire soul, for as long as we both exist, for all the forevers. Victor pronounced them married, and Lucien kissed her deeply while their guests applauded, and Mia shouted, "Yay, Mama married Lucy!" with such enthusiasm that even the ancient vampires in attendance smiled. Nikolai clapped his hands and babbled happily, and Elena felt her grandmother's spirit and Isadora's blessing, and the certainty that this was just the beginning. The reception flowed naturally from ceremony to celebration, the garden lit with strings of lights and candles, while music played from speakers Victor had carefully positioned. They'd hired a caterer who specialized in mixed events, providing both human food and the specialized beverages vampires preferred, and the mixing of species at tables felt like a small victory for integration. Dr. Tanaka gave a toast about the importance of building bridges between worlds. Rosa spoke about watching her sister find happiness after years of struggle. Sienna made everyone cry with her tribute to found family and second chances. Victor's toast was characteristically brief but heartfelt, ending with, "To the most unconventional family I've had the privilege to protect. May you continue to defy expectations and prove that love transcends every boundary." The dancing started as twilight deepened into night, and Elena and Lucien's first dance was to a song he'd commissioned, a modern arrangement of her grandmother's lullaby transformed into something celebratory rather than protective. They swayed together while their guests watched, and halfway through, Elena began to sing along softly, her voice carrying the melody, while Lucien hummed harmony in a language she didn't recognize, but that felt right somehow. When the song ended, the guests erupted in applause, and Elder Dawn, who had come to represent the Trinity's blessing, approached with tears in her ancient eyes. "I've attended thousands of weddings across millennia," the elder said quietly. "I've never seen one more genuine than this. You honor us all by choosing love over fear." The celebration continued into the night, with Mia eventually falling asleep on a blanket under Sienna's watch, while Nikolai dozed in his carrier. Elena danced with her sister and Dr. Tanaka and even Victor, who proved surprisingly competent despite claiming to have learned in a different century. Lucien moved through the crowd with her hand in his, introducing her to delegates and allies, making clear that she was his equal partner in everything that came next. As midnight approached, a messenger vampire appeared at the garden entrance and requested permission to deliver correspondence. Victor intercepted and brought the sealed letter to Lucien, who opened it with Elena reading over his shoulder. The letter was formal and brief, written in elegant script on heavy paper. It came from a vampire clan in Eastern Europe, congratulating them on their marriage and wishing them well. But the final paragraph carried an unmistakable warning. "While we celebrate this union and applaud the Trinity's progressive stance, please be aware that Dorian Volkov's family has not forgotten the circumstances of his death. The old ways die hard, and revenge is a dish best served over decades or centuries. We offer this information as courtesy between houses, not as threat. May your family remain vigilant. Lucian read it twice, and then walked calmly to one of the candles and held the letter to the flame until it was ash. "Let them come," he said loud enough for nearby guests to hear. "We've proven we can survive anything." Elena felt a chill despite the warm night, but nodded agreement. "We'll face it together," she said. "Whatever comes, whenever it comes, we're stronger together than apart." The messenger bowed and departed, and the celebration resumed, though Elena noticed Victor immediately increasing the guard presence around the perimeter. They didn't tell the children, wouldn't burden them with fears about distant threats, but Elena and Lucien shared a look of understanding. Their world would always hold danger. The integration they were fighting for would always face resistance from those who preferred the old hierarchies and separations. But they would keep building their family and their future anyway, keep pushing for change, keep proving that love could transcend every boundary that prejudice tried to enforce. As the reception wound down and guests began departing, Elena and Lucian slipped away to check on the children. They found both asleep in the nursery, Mia curled in her bed and Nikolai in his crib, and stood together watching them breathe in the comfortable silence of exhausted happiness. "Do you think Isadora would approve?" Elena asked quietly. "I think she led you to us," Lucian said with certainty. "I think she's been watching over Nikolai all along. Through you, her essence in your blood, her lullaby on your lips, her love manifested in how you care for her son. She knew you'd protect him when I couldn't." "Then I'll keep singing," Elena said. "For all of us. For her memory and our future and the children we're raising together." She began the lullaby softly, the familiar Euskara words flowing easily now after months of practice and study. The protection layer hummed just beneath the surface, a shield and blessing combined, and both children shifted in their sleep as if responding to the magic. Lucien wrapped his arms around her from behind and rested his chin on her shoulder while she sang all 3 verses, and when the last note faded, they stood in peaceful silence. The image was perfect in its imperfection, this little family visible through the nursery window from the street outside. The brownstone glowed warmly against the New York night, its garden still lit with celebration lights, and inside the 3rd-floor nursery, Elena and Lucien stood together watching their children sleep. It was domestic and tender and full of hope for futures that seemed impossible a year ago. The camera of imagination pulled back slowly, showing more of the brownstone and the quiet street, the city settling into its late-night rhythms. Further back still until the building was just one point of light among thousands. New York spreading out in every direction with millions of stories unfolding simultaneously. But one story in particular mattered in this moment. The tale of a single mother and a vampire king, and 2 children who had brought them together. The narrative of family built from loss and choice, and stubborn determination to create something better. As the perspective widened further, a figure became visible across the street, partially hidden in shadows between streetlights. Just a shape, humanoid but indistinct, watching the brownstone with patient attention. A reminder that their world still held danger, that the old grudges and ancient hatreds didn't disappear just because 2 people fell in love. The threat was distant but real, a storm on the horizon that might arrive in years or decades or centuries depending on how vampire revenge calculus worked. But inside the nursery, the lullaby continued, soft and protective and eternal. Elena's voice carried power accumulated over generations, her grandmother's gift, and Isadora's blessing, and her own growing strength all woven together. The children slept peacefully under that shield of sound and magic, and Lucian held Elena close while she sang their family's anthem. The figure in the shadows eventually turned and disappeared into the New York night, and the camera continued pulling back until the brownstone was just another building in an endless cityscape. But the lullaby persisted, inaudible now but present nonetheless, a thread of protection and love stretching across time and space. Elena Reyes had stopped running and started building, had found family in the most unexpected places, and her voice would keep singing through whatever challenges came next. For Mia and Nikolai, for Lucienne and the future they were creating together, for her grandmother Amaya and Isadora, whose love transcended death, for all the families trying to exist between worlds, proving that change was possible if you were brave enough to demand it. The brownstone's lights stayed on late into the night, warm against the darkness, a beacon of hope and defiance, and the stubborn human insistence that love could overcome anything. Inside, a family slept. Outside, the city hummed. And somewhere in the spaces between, the lullaby echoed on. The recovery took longer than Maya expected because silver toxicity in vampires worked differently than any poison she understood from human medicine. The metal interfering with cellular regeneration at a fundamental level that turned healing into a battle between vampire nature and chemical destruction. Dominic spent 3 days in a fever state that terrified her despite Isadora's calm assurances that he would survive, his body temperature fluctuating wildly as it tried to purge the silver from his system while simultaneously repairing tissue damage. Maya stayed with him through all of it, sleeping in a chair beside his bed, when exhaustion finally overwhelmed her anxiety, waking to check his breathing and temperature with the obsessive attention of someone who had nearly lost what she was only beginning to recognize as essential. He was delirious for most of the first 2 days, murmuring in languages she did not recognize, fragments of Latin and Old French, and something that might have been medieval Italian, his hands moving restlessly as if fighting enemies only he could see. He called her name sometimes, voice rough and desperate, and she would take his hand and talk to him quietly about nothing important, just the sound of her voice anchoring him to the present. She read to him from books she found in his library, histories and poetry and technical manuals about urban infrastructure, because she thought he might find comfort in familiar topics even if he could not consciously process the words. Isadora came and went with medical supplies and updates, her expression carefully neutral, but her tension visible in the tight set of her shoulders. The sniper was one of Elena's enforcers, she said on the second day, confirming what they had all suspected. We recovered the rifle and traced it to a vampire who has worked for Elena's faction for decades. She has been formally censured by the council, but not removed from her position because she is too powerful and has too many allies who fear that punishing her would trigger factional war. Maya felt fury rise hot in her chest at the injustice of it, at the political calculation that valued stability over accountability, but she channeled it into determination rather than despair. Then we change the system that protects her, Maya said. We build something better than fear-based compromise. The Hunter Pact held despite the assassination attempt, Sarah's team actually helping to secure the area after the shooting in a show of goodwill that proved cooperation was possible even under pressure. Sarah sent a message through Marcus that was brief but significant. Tell your liaison that my people honor agreements, and we expect the same from vampires. It was not friendship, but it was functional trust, the foundation that real alliance could eventually build on. Jamie visited on the 3rd day, after Maya finally agreed that Dominic was stable enough for her to handle an interruption, and her brother's first proper meeting with the Vampire King happened in a bedroom that smelled of blood and antiseptic, while Dominic was semi-conscious and too weak to be intimidating. Jamie stood in the doorway and looked at the man who had upended his sister's life, taking in the visible injury and the expensive sheets and the evidence of wealth and power that even illness could not completely obscure. This is him, Jamie said, and it was not quite a question. This is him, Maya confirmed, watching her brother process the reality of vampires and supernatural politics, and the fact that his sister was in love with someone who was fundamentally not human. Jamie walked closer and studied Dominic with the same analytical attention that Maya recognized from her own approach to complex problems. "He hurt you," he said to Maya without taking his eyes off Dominic. "He lied to you for months. Why are you here instead of letting him heal alone?" "Because he took a bullet meant for me," Maya said. "Because he gave up his throne to protect my autonomy. Because he is trying to build something better than the world he inherited, and I want to help him do that." Jamie finally looked at his sister, his expression softening slightly. "You love him," he said, and it was still not quite a question, but it was closer. "I am starting to," Maya admitted. "I do not know if that is smart or sustainable, but it is true." Dominic stirred at the sound of voices, his eyes opening with difficulty, consciousness surfacing through fever haze. He focused on Jamie with visible effort and managed to speak in a voice that was rough but clear. "You must be the brother," he said. "Maya talks about you constantly. How you got into medical school on a full scholarship. How you want to specialize in pediatric oncology. How she worked 3 jobs to make sure you had opportunities she never got." Jamie's expression shifted to something that might have been surprise or respect. "She told you that," he said. "She tells me everything now," Dominic said, and the weight he gave the word now acknowledged all the lies that had come before. "I am trying to earn the same honesty from her, even though I started from a position of deception that gives me no right to expect trust." Jamie gave what Maya privately called his protective brother assessment, the look that evaluated threats and measured sincerity and decided whether someone was worthy of his sister's time. After a long moment, he nodded slightly. "If you hurt her again, I will find a way to hurt you back," he said. "I do not care if you are immortal or powerful or whatever. She deserves better than more lies." "Agreed," Dominic said simply, and Maya felt something warm expand in her chest at the understanding passing between the two most important men in her life. Marcus brought Maya coffee on the 4th day, when Dominic was finally sleeping naturally, rather than thrashing through fever dreams, and the vampire who had been Dominic's right hand for decades sat across from her in the penthouse living room with an expression that held something Maya had not seen before. "You brokered a peace in one night that we could not achieve in a century," Marcus said, his voice holding respect that felt hard-won. "The hunters could have killed us all in that warehouse, but you made them see past their fear long enough to recognize shared interest. That is a skill that cannot be taught." "I just use the same logic I apply to infrastructure analysis," Maya said, exhaustion making her honest. "Find the common elements, identify the mutual dependencies, propose systems that serve both parties better than conflict does." Marcus smiled slightly. "That is exactly what Dominic has been trying to do for 100 years, he said. Maybe he needed someone who could see the patterns without the weight of centuries of tradition making them invisible. Maya realized during those long days of watching Dominic heal that she was not just surviving anymore, that somewhere in the transition from captive to trial participant to peace negotiator, she had stopped reacting to circumstances and started actively building something new. She decided to quit her job at the infrastructure firm, not out of fear or compulsion, but because the work she was doing as liaison felt more important and more aligned with skills she had spent her whole life developing. She called her supervisor and gave notice, citing an opportunity in private consulting that would let her work on urban systems at a larger scale, which was technically true even if the specifics were impossible to explain. 1 month later, the city had settled into a new rhythm that looked almost normal on the surface, but that Maya could see was fundamentally different when she knew where to look. She had moved into Dominic's penthouse after careful discussion about autonomy and boundaries and the importance of maintaining her own identity, even while building a life with someone who had lived for centuries. Her things occupied half the closet, and her books filled shelves in the library, and her coffee maker sat on the kitchen counter next to his espresso machine. Small markers of cohabitation that felt significant precisely because they were chosen rather than assumed. The relationship they were building was awkward and sweet and complicated, two people learning each other without the performance or deception that had characterized their early interactions. Dominic was discovering what it meant to share space with someone who challenged his assumptions and refused to defer to age or power, while Maya was learning to trust that his care for her was genuine rather than strategic. They argued about politics and infrastructure and whether it was reasonable to reorganize the entire kitchen because the current system made no logical sense, and they figured out compromise in small increments that built toward something that might eventually be called partnership. The Hunter Pact had held through joint operations that targeted 3 rogue vampires in the first month, coordinated raids that proved both sides could work together when objectives aligned. Sarah's team provided human intelligence and tactical planning, while Dominic's people contributed vampire tracking expertise and knowledge of supernatural vulnerabilities, and the operations succeeded in ways that purely vampire or purely human efforts would have failed. Maya coordinated everything, managing information flow and ensuring both sides followed agreed protocols, and the work was exhausting but meaningful in ways her old job had never been. They returned to the rooftop where they had first kissed 1 month after the warehouse confrontation. The same view of the city spreading below them in patterns of light that Maya could now read with deeper understanding. She could identify vampire-owned buildings by their security systems and power consumption. Could see the subtle integration happening as some vampire businesses started hiring human liaisons and experimenting with transparency about ownership structure. It was not peace exactly, but it was movement towards something better than the fearful secrecy that had defined centuries of coexistence. "I never thought I would have this," Dominic said quietly, his arm around her shoulders as they looked out at their city. "Someone who knows everything and stays anyway. Someone who sees what I am and chooses me rather than settling for me because they do not understand the alternatives. I never thought I would fall for someone who could literally kill me without trying," Maya said, leaning into his warmth. "Someone who has lived through more history than I can imagine, and who still somehow needs what I can offer." "I never would," Dominic said, and she heard the absolute certainty in his voice. "Kill you. Hurt you. Take away your choice. Those are lines I will never cross." "I know," Maya said. "That is why I am here." He kissed her, and this time there were no interruptions, no emergencies or assassins, or political crises demanding immediate attention. This time there was just the two of them on a rooftop above a city that was changing because they had chosen to change it. And the kiss was sweet and deep, and full of promise that felt sustainable because it was built on truth rather than fantasy. The formal letter arrived 2 weeks after that, delivered by Rafael Santos himself in a gesture that spoke to the importance the council placed on the offer. The envelope was heavy cream paper, with the council seal pressed into red wax, formal and official, in a way that made Maya's analytical mind immediately start calculating implications. Raphael waited while she opened it, his ancient face patient and unreadable. "The council wants to establish an official human liaison office," he said as she read through the formal language of the invitation. "You would have a seat at council meetings, voice in policy decisions, authority to investigate complaints from both human and vampire populations. You would be the bridge between our peoples with real power to shape how coexistence evolves." Maya read through the offer carefully, parsing the responsibilities and the risks with the same attention she would give any contract negotiation. The position came with salary that was generous but not obscene, security detail that would be necessary given the targets she had already made, and office space in the council building that would put her in the heart of vampire politics. What she would give up was any chance of a normal life, any possibility of returning to anonymous infrastructure analysis and quiet evenings without the weight of two species' futures resting on her decisions. "What is the catch?" she asked Raphael, because nothing with the council came without hidden complications. You would be a target for both reformists who think you are moving too slowly and traditionalists who think you should not exist at all, Raphael said bluntly. You would navigate political waters that have drowned vampires with centuries of experience. You would have power, but you would also have enemies who will work constantly to undermine or eliminate you. So basically what I am already doing, but with a title and a paycheck, Maya said. And Raphael smiled slightly. Essentially, yes, he confirmed, but with institutional backing and the authority to make changes that stick, rather than negotiating everything from the margins. Dominic was waiting when she returned to the penthouse, his expression carefully neutral in a way that told her he was trying not to influence her decision. You do not have to accept, he said. You have done enough, survived more than anyone could reasonably expect. You have earned the right to walk away and build a quiet life. Have I? Maya asked, thinking of Jamie and Sarah's hunters and all the humans who moved through the city without knowing the supernatural structures that shaped their lives. Have I really done enough when the systems are still broken and the fear is still there, and the next Elena is probably already planning how to undermine everything we built? She thought about her parents who had died too young, about raising Jamie while building a career from nothing, about the fierce independence that had defined her entire adult life, and how that independence had evolved into something that looked more like interdependence, like recognizing that individual freedom was meaningless without systems that protected everyone's ability to choose. She thought about the trials and the terror and the understanding that she had survived not just through her own skills, but through allies who had chosen to help her when they could have looked away. I accept, she said, meeting Dominic's eyes. I accept the position and everything that comes with it. Her first official act as human liaison was to demand Elena's removal from the council for the assassination attempt, formal charges filed through proper channels with evidence that Marcus's investigation had compiled over the previous month. The vote was called in an emergency council session that Maya attended for the first time, not as a defendant or a curiosity, but as an official participant with voice and standing. She presented the case with the same analytical precision she had once applied to infrastructure reports, laying out timeline and evidence, and the argument that assassination of diplomatic personnel was grounds for immediate removal regardless of political considerations. The debate was intense and bitter, Elena's allies arguing that the evidence was circumstantial, and that removing a council member would set dangerous precedent, reformist faction countering that allowing assassination attempts to go unpunished would make any peace process impossible. Maya watched vampire politics play out in real time, saw the calculations and the old alliances and the fear that still drove so many decisions, and she understood that this vote was about far more than Elena's fate, that it was a test of whether the council could actually change or whether reform was just performance. The vote was called and Maya held her breath as hands rose around the chamber. Victor voted for removal. Raphael voted for removal. Yuki voted for removal after a long pause. Aisha voted for removal. 4 votes, 1 short of the majority needed. Celine, who had been neutral on everything, looked at Maya for a long moment and then raised her hand. 5 votes for removal, 3 against. Elena lost her seat on the council that she had held for over a century. Elena stood with the cold dignity of someone who had survived worse defeats and would plan her revenge with the patience of immortality. She locked eyes with Maya as she walked toward the chamber exit, her expression promising future conflict. "This is not over," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the sudden silence. "I know," Maya said, meeting her gaze without flinching. "But I am not afraid of you anymore." The story ended where it began, in Maya's apartment that had been rebuilt and renovated during the month of recovery, the space now secure in ways that reflected her new reality. She sat on her couch testing the new iPhone that Dominic's tech team had developed, a prototype that incorporated vampire biometric scanning without the glitches that had started everything. The technology worked flawlessly, the camera analyzing Dominic's face and displaying accurate data about heart rate and temperature, and the subtle markers that distinguished vampire from human physiology. She laughed at the absurdity of it, how a phone malfunction had upended her entire life and led to trials and assassination attempts, and becoming the first human liaison to vampire government in 2 centuries. Dominic leaned over her shoulder to look at the screen, his face appearing in the camera view. And this time the Face ID unlocked immediately, recognizing him as an authorized user rather than rejecting him as an anomaly. "Progress," Maya said, holding up the phone. "Slow," Dominic replied, "but real." Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number, the message appearing on screen with the jarring immediacy of communication from outside their carefully controlled circle. Maya opened it and felt cold understanding settle over her as she read the words. "Congratulations on your new position. We should meet. There are things the council has not told you. A friend." She showed the message to Dominic and watched his expression shift from contentment to concern, his centuries of political experience recognizing threat assessment in the careful phrasing. "That is not one of ours," he said, scanning the number that appeared to be routed through multiple proxies. "Not council, not Elena's faction, not any vampire communication I recognize." "Then whose?" Maya asked, and the question hung in the air between them with all its implications. The phone screen went dark as the message disappeared, deleted remotely by whoever had sent it, leaving no trace except Maya's memory of the words. She stood and walked to the window, where the city sprawled below them in patterns that she could now read with deeper understanding, vampire infrastructure and human systems woven together in ways that most people would never see. Dominic joined her there, and they stood together looking out at their city full of secrets and possibilities and threats that had not yet revealed themselves. Maya smiled despite the uncertainty, despite the new mystery that promised to complicate the fragile peace they had built, because she had learned during the trials that fear was not a reason to stop moving forward. "I guess we will find out," she said. And in her voice was the determination that had carried her through impossible challenges and the understanding that coexistence would always be a work in progress rather than a finished achievement.